Why was the Black Prince called the Black Prince when his real name was Edward of Woodstock? As royal nicknames go, this one is pretty good, I think, but this famous warrior prince from 14th century England wasn't even referred to by this moniker during his lifetime, and there are conflicting stories regarding its origins. This is History Calling, where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past, and today we're going to look at this ruthless one-time heir to the throne and at the curious tale of how he gained his unforgettable name. Before I jump in, if you love history and would like more of it delivered straight to you, please hit the like and subscribe button beneath this video and switch on the notification bell so that YouTube lets you know when I upload. You can also find links to my social media and Patreon sites in the description box below. Edward of Woodstock was born on the 15th of June 1330 and was the eldest son of King Edward III of England and his wife Philippa of Hainaut. I found numerous pronunciations for that one online, by the way, so I hope I've chosen the correct one. The Woodstock referred to his place of birth, but he had a raft of other titles. A prince from birth, he was made Earl of Chester whilst still only 2 years old, Duke of Cornwall at the age of 6, and in 1343 he was created Prince of Wales. From a young age, he was heavily involved in the running of his father's realm, as he was prepared to someday become monarch himself. At 8 years old, he was named Custos Anglia, meaning Guardian of England, when the king went abroad, and he was travelling with him on military campaigns when he was barely a teenager. He began his life as a soldier at the age of 16 when his father knighted him in Normandy, and fought soon after at the Battle of Crécy, where he was nearly killed or at the very least captured by French forces. He would go on to fight for and sometimes alongside his father in many other battles during his lifetime, most notably in Aquitaine in 1355 and at the Battle of Poitiers in September 1356, during which the French king Jean was captured and brought to England as a prisoner. In 1360, an agreement with the French saw Aquitaine given to Edward as a sovereign state over which he would be prince, and in 1361 he married his cousin Joan, Countess of Kent, a widowed woman in her 30s who already had 4 surviving children. The Prince and Princess of Wales moved to what is now modern-day France to manage Aquitaine in 1363, where Edward made himself unpopular through the levying of high taxes, his extravagant expenditure, and his generally high-handed manner. During this time, he and Joan would have 2 sons, another Edward, born in 1365, who died at the age of 5, and the future Richard II, who was born in 1367. Edward continued to have to fight to maintain his authority in the region, and there were battles with Enrique de Trastamara, half-brother and usurper of Edward's sometime ally Pedro the Cruel. In fact, it was supposedly as an acknowledgement of his military help that Pedro gave Edward the stone known as the Black Prince's Ruby, which is actually a spinel, which now sits in the imperial state crown of Great Britain. In reality, the stone's history is a lot murkier and more complex than this legend indicates though, and if you watch my video on it, I tell you all about its provenance, real and fake, there. Despite repeated bouts of ill health and criticism from his father and the English magnates regarding his management of Aquitaine, Edward went on campaign again in 1369, seizing the city of Limoges and largely destroying it in the process, though there are conflicting accounts as to whether or not he and his men engaged in a massacre of the citizens, but those reports which do exist have certainly helped to build that ruthless reputation I mentioned at the start of the video. He returned to England in 1370, and with his health still poor and probably only getting worse, he surrendered Aquitaine to his father in 1372. On the 8th of June 1376, he died at Westminster Palace, and was buried in Canterbury Cathedral in October. So where does the title The Black Prince come into this? The short answer is, it doesn't. The earliest confirmed reference we have to him being called by this name dates to the mid-Tudor period. In 1545, Roger Ascham, whose name you might recognise because he was a tutor to the future Elizabeth I as well as Lady Jane Grey, published a book called Toxophilus, in which he discussed the aforementioned Battle of Crécy. Within this discussion he said, "Such like battle also fought the noble Black Prince Edward." Another contemporary Tudor writer also used this nickname for the long-dead Prince of Wales. In his book De Rebus Britannicus Collectanea, John Leland called Edward Edwardi Principis Cog Nigri, with the cog short for either cogniti or a slight variation of that word. The phrase can be translated as Edward known as the Black Prince. Elsewhere in the same book, but this time in English, he describes him as the Black Prince. This work was published posthumously, and Leland died in 1552, so his use of the term cannot postdate that year. In 1569, the writer Richard Grafton wrote of Edward in his Chronicle of English History that some writers name him the Black Prince, and in the index within the same book, he went further when he listed an entry for Edward, Prince of Wales and eldest son of King Edward III, commonly called the Black Prince. It remained a popular epithet for Edward as the early modern period progressed. Raphael Holinshed wrote in his Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland, published in 1577, that the prince was commonly named when he came to ripe years Prince Edward, and also surnamed the Black Prince, though he stopped short of explaining when this sobriquet appeared. Elsewhere, though, he supported Grafton's assertion that the name was at least in common usage by the Elizabethan period, saying, Edward, Prince of Wales, eldest son to King Edward, commonly called the Black Prince. Like the first reference, this line could be read as a claim that the term was used during Edward's lifetime, but it isn't stated definitively. Circling back to Shakespeare, in his play Richard II, written in the 1590s, Edward is mentioned in Act 2, Scene 3, where he is called the Black Prince, that young Mars of men, a reference to the Roman god of war Mars, and an allusion to Edward's famed military prowess. He pops up in the play Henry V too. In Act 1, Scene 2, he is called Edward the Black Prince, who on the French ground played a tragedy, making defeat on the full power of France. In Act 2, Scene 4 comes the line, When Crecy battle fatally was struck, and all our princes captived by the hand of that black name, Edward, Black Prince of Wales. It wasn't just in texts that the name was used. This 1648 imagined image of Edward also sports the term, and in 1669 Roger Boyle, Earl of Orrery, published 2 plays under the title Two New Tragedies, The Black Prince and Tryphon, suggesting that the name was now so heavily associated with Edward that it was no longer even necessary to explicitly state that it was connected to him. Orrery could just assume that his audience would know who the Black Prince was. You may have noted that I said that the 1545 Ascham reference was the earliest confirmed allusion to the name. The reason I hedged my bets in this way is that I did come across 2 unconfirmed references to the term the Black Prince, which supposedly dated to his own lifetime and that of his son Richard II. One comes from a book of material collected by English MP and antiquarian Sir Robert Cotton, but later organised and published by William Prynne in 1657, over 25 years after Cotton's death. Cotton's notes provided an abridgment, that's the key term by the way, of the records held in the Tower of London at the time. Referring to the parliamentary records for the second year of the reign of Richard II, he said, Sundry nobles are named to examine the revenues arising of the subsidy of wool, and to examine all the revenues of the realm, viz. The old maltolth of wools, the revenues of priors aliens, and all other receipts of the king whatsoever. To examine what fees the nobles and officers received in the beginning of E3, that's Edward III, what annuities were granted by E3, or the Black Prince his son. As you can tell when you see this reference in context, what we actually have here is Cotton's summary of the rather boring financial record he was reading through in the Tower, and not a transcript. There's no reason to think that the original Ricardian record called Edward the Black Prince. Instead, this seems to have been Cotton's preferred way of describing him, which is perfectly in line with what we have already seen, namely that Edward was commonly called by this moniker by the 17th century. Unfortunately, other writers don't seem to have realised this is what was happening, and in 1688 Joshua Barnes wrote a book in which he said that in the records of 2 Richard 2 N12 he is called the Black Prince. This reference is to the parliamentary records that Cotton summarised in his 1657 book, and we can tell that Barnes is using Cotton's work to inform his own because he also cites Cotton. As we've just seen though, Cotton's use of the term Black Prince seems to have been his own choice and not something copied from the parliamentary rules. Furthermore, when I looked at said parliamentary rules, I saw no such reference. The second reference to the use of this term during the 1300s also comes from Barnes, who wrote elsewhere in his book that the French began to call Edward Le Noir, or the Black Prince, after the Battle of Crécy in 1346. His source for this information, the French chronicler Jean Froissart, doesn't mention this, however, and again we seem to have what I would call a phantom source. It looks good at first, but when you follow it up, it leads nowhere. Having established that Barnes, Cotton and Froissart are dead-end sources when it comes to backdating the name to the 14th century, I therefore continue to believe that the earliest known reference to this term is still the note in the 1545 Ascham book I told you about a few minutes ago. We therefore have a 169-year gap between the prince's death and the first definite use of the term Black Prince to describe him. Yet Ascham, Leland and especially Grafton's work do not suggest that it was a new descriptor at the time they were writing. They treated it as though it was in common usage and needed no explanation, and it seems very possible that there were indeed earlier references to the Black Prince which have simply not survived to us. This might seem incredible to some of you, but bear in mind that there remains no contemporary evidence from the lifetime of Richard III, which mentions his scoliosis, meaning curvature of the spine, yet William Shakespeare clearly knew about it over a century later when he wrote his play on the last Plantagenet king, and it was confirmed when Richard's bones were discovered in 2012. Far more evidence has been lost over the centuries than has survived, and it seems that whenever the term Black Prince was coined to describe Edward, it was well known by the 1540s at the latest. Why was he given this name, though? There are two popular theories often used to explain the origins of the term the Black Prince, neither one of which has any support in 14th or even 15th century sources. The first is that it was a comment on the colour of Edward's armour, which is popularly reported to have been black, though no one seems to know exactly how this story came about. Joshua Barnes made what might be an oblique reference to this story, saying that one reason Edward was called this was that he was dyed black by the terror of his arms. Again, he suggested that this story came from Jean Froissart, and it was picked up and repeated in 1824 by Sir Samuel Mayrick, yet there does not appear to be any such comment in Froissart's work, and the tale is therefore another wild goose chase. There is pictorial evidence for this theory as well as documentary, for this picture was once thought to show the prince on the basis of the sitter's dark clothing, even though what he's wearing isn't really armour. We also see the black armour myth perpetuated in this 1888 picture of Edward at Crécy, standing over the dead body of the Bohemian king. The description given of the portrait on the website of the Telfair Museums in Savannah, which holds this painting, even reiterates the fable about the connection between the name and the armour, as does a page on the website of the Royal Collection Trust in the UK. But again, I can't emphasise enough that there isn't any indication in the original sources that this is true. Sir Samuel Mayrick wrote that there was no evidence that the prince had worn black armour, but that he might have worn a black surcoat and carried a black shield whilst competing in tournaments, so that, quote, it might have been from the covering of his armour that he was so called. The second theory is that the name refers to Edward's conduct whilst campaigning in France, and in particular to his cruel treatment of locals caught up in his wars. Shakespeare certainly insinuated that this was the root of the sobriquet. Remember his comparison of Edward to the god of war, his assertion that the prince had perpetuated a tragedy on French ground, and the line in Henry V which read, "When Crécy battle fatally was struck, and all our princes captived by the hand of that black name, Edward, Black Prince of Wales." This is the earliest evidence I've come across for the name being a reference to the nature of Edward's deeds and character. The idea was picked up on by later writers, though, to explain the term. In 1631, John Weaver, whilst considering Edward's funerary monument, said, "Let me view the sumptuous monument still remaining of Edward, surnamed the Black Prince, so by named not of his colour, but of his dreaded acts in battle." In 1642, fellow English writer Thomas Fuller provided a barely reworded version of Weaver's text, writing that Edward was so called from his dreaded acts and not from his complexion. Barnes also said that it was for his dreadful deeds in war that Edward acquired the surname Le Noir from the French. Again, he gave Froissart as the source for this information, but again, I read the cited section and couldn't find anything which corroborated this. To make matters even more confusing, Samuel Mayrick then repeated this story, also giving the pseudo-Froissart reference and perpetuating the myth that there is some basis for the Black Prince story dating back to the Middle Ages. What we seem to be seeing is a series of writers copying the ideas of earlier authors dating back to at least Shakespeare. None of them provide any real evidence to support the idea that Edward was known by this name during his lifetime, or that it stemmed from his actions on the battlefield. Weaver and Fuller's comments also indicate that there was some confusion, even in the early to mid-17th century, about what the name was meant to refer to, with some supposing that it might have been a comment on the prince's skin tone. Not that they thought he was actually black, but in the 17th century this might have been used as a way to describe a white person with an olive skin tone or a deep tan. Queen Anne Boleyn was called swarthy in the 16th century, for instance, simply because she didn't happen to be as pale as some of the other ladies at court. It's interesting, though, that Shakespeare, Weaver and Fuller did not feel the need to dispel any myth about the colour of the prince's armour, leading me to wonder if that theory hadn't emerged yet. As for Edward's possible misdeeds, as I told you earlier, he was just 16 at the time of the Battle of Crécy and was nearly killed himself. And though there were reports of massacres at the siege of Limoges in 1369, these stories are disputed. He was unpopular in Aquitaine, it is true, but this was largely due to his taxation policy, extravagance, and personality. In short, we have no conclusive evidence as to when or why Edward began to be called the Black Prince, and the best we can say is that the name appears to have been in common usage by the 1540s, and that it was associated with his dreaded acts by the time Shakespeare was writing in the 1590s, over 200 years after the death of this one-time Prince of Wales. Before I go, thank you as always to my wonderful patrons whose support helps me to make this a viable career, and to those of you who donate to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos, as your support is also much appreciated. Let me know in the comments below why you think Edward might have gained the name the Black Prince, and until next time, keep learning.